You believe you are a good person. You would never hurt anyone. You condemn cruelty. You oppose injustice. And yet you participate in systems of harm every single day. You believe that cruelty is individual moral failure, that people who do terrible things are fundamentally different from you, that you would recognize evil if you encountered it and would refuse to participate. You think of cruelty as conscious choice made by bad people, as intentional malice that you are incapable of because you are a decent person who cares about others and wants to do right thing. But cruelty is not primarily individual moral failure. Cruelty is architectural, is systemic, is built into structures and institutions and social arrangements that turn ordinary people into participants in harm without them recognizing what they are doing, without them experiencing themselves as cruel, often while they believe they are doing good or necessary or reasonable thing. The most devastating cruelty in human history has not been committed by monsters, but by normal people following orders, conforming to social expectations, participating in systems they did not create, but that they maintain through their compliance. You are not exempt from this. You participate in exploitative economic systems, in institutions that perpetuate inequality and suffering, in social arrangements that dehumanize and exclude and harm. And you do this while maintaining self-image as good person, while condemning cruelty in abstract, while participating in it in practice, while believing that you would never do what you are already doing because the architecture of moral failure has made your participation invisible to you. Understanding how society programs us for cruelty requires examining not individual character, but systemic structures that make ordinary people capable of extraordinary harm. You follow orders. You do your job. You fulfill your role. You call this responsibility. It is participation in systemic harm. Society programs you for cruelty through diffusion of responsibility, through creating systems where harm is distributed across many people so that no single person feels responsible for the outcome, where you can participate in terrible things while experiencing yourself as just doing your job or following orders or fulfilling your role in larger process. When responsibility is diffused, when you are just one small part of system that produces harm, you can participate without experiencing yourself as cruel because you are not making the decision, are not directly causing the harm, are just performing specific function in process you did not design. You work for a corporation that exploits workers or destroys environments, but you are just doing your job, just fulfilling your specific role, just following policies and procedures that were decided by someone else somewhere else. You are not the one making decisions about wages or working conditions or environmental impact. You are just processing paperwork or managing logistics or executing decisions that came from above. The harm is real, but your responsibility feels abstract because you are so many steps removed from actual suffering that your role produces. The diffusion creates psychological distance where you can participate in harm without confronting what you are participating in, where you can focus on your specific tasks and procedures without engaging with larger system you are part of, where you can tell yourself you are just following orders or doing your job as if this absolves you of responsibility for outcomes your actions contribute to. The more complex the system, the more steps between your action and the harm it produces, the easier it is to participate without feeling culpable. This is how ordinary people participate in extraordinary harm, not through conscious choice to be cruel, but through fulfilling roles in systems designed to produce harm, while distributing responsibility so thinly that nobody feels accountable. You are just following orders, just doing your job, just one small part of machine, and this allows you to participate in systemic cruelty while maintaining self-image as good person who would never intentionally hurt anyone. The system requires your participation, but has structured that participation so you never have to confront what you are actually doing. They become numbers, statistics, categories, demographics. You call this efficiency. It is dehumanization. Society programs you for cruelty through creating distance and abstraction that prevent you from confronting the humanity of people your actions affect, through reducing human beings to data points and categories and statistics that allow you to make decisions about their lives without engaging with them as actual humans with feelings and relationships and subjective experience of suffering. When people are abstracted into numbers, when you interact with them through spreadsheets and reports and demographics, rather than through direct human contact, you can participate in their harm without experiencing the moral weight of what you are doing. You make decisions that affect thousands of people, but you never meet them, never see their faces, never hear their stories, never confront the actual human cost of policies and procedures you implement. They are numbers in database, metrics on dashboard, categories in report. You can optimize efficiency and reduce costs and maximize profit without engaging with the fact that these abstractions represent human beings whose lives you are affecting, whose suffering you are causing, whose humanity has been rendered invisible by the systems you operate within. The distance also operates spatially and temporally. The people harmed by your actions are far away, are in other countries or other communities, are separated from you by geographic and social distance that prevents you from confronting consequences of your choices, or the harm occurs in future, is deferred cost that someone else will pay, is consequence you will never witness because it unfolds after you have moved on or retired or died. This distance allows you to participate in harm without emotional or moral weight that direct confrontation with suffering would create. The abstraction and distance are not accidental, but are architectural features designed into systems that require human harm to function, are deliberate mechanisms that allow ordinary people to participate in cruelty without experiencing themselves as cruel. When you can reduce people to numbers, when you can create distance between your actions and their consequences, when you can avoid direct confrontation with humanity of those you harm, you can participate in systemic cruelty while maintaining self-image as a decent person who would never intentionally hurt anyone. The dehumanization is built into the structure, makes your participation possible by making the humanity of victims invisible. You use proper terminology, professional language, neutral descriptions, technical terms. You call this professionalism. It is moral disengagement. Society programs you for cruelty through language that disguises harm as neutral procedure, through euphemisms and technical terminology that allow you to discuss terrible things without confronting their moral reality, through professional discourse that frames cruelty as necessary or efficient or regrettable but unavoidable. When you can talk about harm using sanitized language, when you can describe suffering in technical terms that obscure its human reality, you can participate in cruelty without moral discomfort, because the language itself prevents you from engaging with what you are actually doing. You do not fire people, you restructure or right size or optimize workforce. You do not exploit workers. You maximize efficiency or remain competitive or control labor costs. You do not destroy communities. You implement development projects or pursue economic growth. You do not kill civilians. You minimize collateral damage or neutralize targets. The euphemistic language allows you to discuss harm without naming it as harm, allows you to participate in cruelty without using words that would force you to confront moral reality of what you are doing. The professional terminology also creates sense that these are technical decisions based on objective criteria rather than moral choices with human consequences. You are not choosing to harm people, you are implementing best practices, following data-driven decision-making, optimizing outcomes. The language of professionalism and expertise obscures the moral dimension, makes it seem like these are neutral technical matters rather than choices about who will suffer and how much, makes it seem like there is no alternative because the system demands these outcomes. This linguistic moral disengagement is essential to how ordinary people participate in systemic cruelty. because it allows you to think and talk about what you are doing without experiencing it as morally problematic. The language creates cognitive buffer between your actions and their human cost, allows you to participate in harm while maintaining self-concept as good person, because you are not using words that would force you to acknowledge that you are participating in cruelty. You are just implementing policy, following procedures, using correct professional terminology, and the language itself ensures you never have to confront what these neutral-sounding words actually mean for the humans affected. Everyone else does it. Everyone accepts it. Everyone goes along. You call this normal. It is conformity to systemic cruelty. Society programs you for cruelty through social pressure and conformity, through creating environments where participating in harm is normalized and expected and rewarded, while refusing to participate is framed as unreasonable or naive or disruptive. When cruelty is institutional norm, when everyone around you is participating, when the social and professional costs of resistance are high, you go along not because you are individually cruel, but because human beings are powerfully motivated to conform to group norms and avoid social punishment for deviation. You see others participating in practices you find morally questionable, but you do not speak up because speaking up would mark you as troublemaker, would threaten your position, would violate social norms of going along to get along. You witness harm, but you remain silent because everyone else is remaining silent, because raising objection would require you to position yourself against the group, because conformity is easier and safer and more socially rewarded than resistance. The pressure is not explicit threat, but is implicit understanding that compliance is expected and deviation will be punished through social exclusion or professional consequences. The conformity is reinforced through normalization, where harmful practices become so routine and accepted that they stop registering as morally problematic. When everyone participates, when these practices are standard operating procedure, when they are embedded in institutional culture, they become background normal rather than something that requires moral scrutiny. You stop questioning because questioning would mean challenging not just specific practice but entire system, would mean positioning yourself as outside the consensus, would mean bearing social and professional costs of being the person who does not go along. This is how ordinary decent people participate in institutional cruelty, not through individual moral failure, but through normal human tendency to conform to group norms, to avoid social punishment for deviation, to accept as normal whatever everyone around them accepts as normal. The architecture of cruelty relies on this conformity, designs systems where harm is normalized and expected and socially reinforced, where participating is the path of least resistance, and refusing to participate requires extraordinary moral courage that most people do not possess. You participate not because you are cruel, but because the system has made participation the normal thing to do, and resistance the abnormal thing that will be punished. It starts small, just little compromise, minor accommodation, slight adjustment. You call this reasonable. It is the beginning of moral collapse. Society programs you for cruelty through gradual escalation, through starting with small requests that seem reasonable and incrementally increasing demands until you are participating in things you would have rejected at the outset, through creating slippery slope where each step seems like minor escalation from previous one, but the cumulative effect is that you end up somewhere you never intended to go. When change is gradual, when each step requires only slightly more than previous step, you can end up participating in serious harm without ever making conscious decision to do so. You start by accepting minor policy that seems harsh but justifiable. You accommodate practice that makes you slightly uncomfortable but that everyone else accepts. You go along with procedure that seems questionable but that you tell yourself is necessary. And then the next request is slightly more problematic, but it is just incremental step from what you have already accepted. Just minor escalation that seems consistent with precedent you have already set. And then the next step and the next, each one slightly worse than previous, but never dramatic enough to force you to draw line and refuse. This gradual escalation is how ordinary people end up participating in extraordinary cruelty, not through single decision to do terrible thing, but through series of small compromises and accommodations and adjustments where each individual step seems reasonable given what came before. You never make conscious choice to participate in systemic harm, you just fail to draw a line at any particular point, because each point seems like minor escalation from previous point that you already accepted. The architecture of cruelty relies on this incremental process because it prevents the moral clarity that would come from being asked directly to participate in obviously terrible thing. If you were asked at the outset to do what you eventually end up doing, you would refuse. But you are not asked to do that. You are asked to take small step that seems reasonable, and then another, and another. And by the time you are doing terrible things, you have invested so much in the process and normalized so much already that drawing line feels impossible or arbitrary, or like admitting that everything you have done up to this point was wrong. The system rewards compliance, promotes those who participate, punishes those who resist. You call this meritocracy. It is structural incentive for cruelty. Society programs you for cruelty through institutional structures that reward participation in harm and punish resistance to harm through creating systems where your professional success and social standing and material well-being depend on your willingness to comply with practices that cause suffering. When the institution rewards cruelty and punishes compassion, when your advancement depends on your willingness to implement harmful policies, when resistance threatens your livelihood and position, the incentive structure ensures most people will participate regardless of their personal moral views. You advance in organization not by questioning harmful practices, but by efficiently implementing them, not by prioritizing human well-being, but by optimizing metrics the system values, not by moral courage, but by compliance with institutional norms. The people who get promoted are those who do not ask uncomfortable questions, who implement difficult decisions without hesitation, who prioritize institutional goals over human costs. The people who resist or raise moral objections or refuse to participate are marginalized or pushed out or denied advancement. This creates selection effect, where institutions become increasingly populated by people willing to participate in harm because those are the people who survive and advance within the system, while people with moral qualms either conform or leave. Over time, the institution becomes dominated by people who have demonstrated willingness to prioritize institutional interests over human well-being, who have shown they can implement harmful policies without moral distress, who have proven they value advancement over ethics. The structural incentives also create a situation where even people who privately object to harmful practices participate in them because the costs of resistance are too high. You need your job, need your income, need your professional reputation, cannot afford to position yourself against the institution. So you participate even when you disagree, because the system has made participation economically necessary and resistance economically devastating. You are not a cruel person, but you participate in cruelty because the architecture has made it the only viable option. This is perhaps the most insidious aspect of how society programs cruelty, not through forcing people to be cruel, but through creating structures where cruelty is the path to success and compassion is the path to failure, where the rational self-interested choice is to participate in harm because resistance threatens everything you have worked for and everything you need to survive. You can refuse, you can resist, you can choose differently, but it will cost you, and most people will not pay the price. Resisting the architecture of moral failure requires recognizing that you are not exempt from these mechanisms, that you participate in systemic cruelty not because you are a bad person, but because you are a normal person, operating within systems designed to produce harm through ordinary people's compliance. Resistance begins with rejecting the comforting belief that you would never do what you are already doing, with confronting that you follow orders and fulfill roles in harmful systems, that you participate in dehumanization through distance and abstraction, that you use sanitized language to avoid moral reality, that you conform to normalized cruelty, that you have been gradually escalated into participating in things you would have rejected at outset, that you are incentivized to comply and punished for resisting. Resistance requires moral clarity about what the systems you participate in actually do, requires refusing to accept euphemistic language and professional terminology that obscure harm, requires confronting the human cost of policies and procedures and practices you implement, requires maintaining awareness of the humanity of people reduced to numbers and categories. It requires rejecting the diffusion of responsibility, refusing to hide behind just following orders or just doing my job, accepting that your participation makes you responsible regardless of how many steps removed you are from direct harm. Resistance requires willingness to refuse conformity even when refusal is socially punished, to speak up even when everyone else is silent, to draw lines even when those lines threaten your position. It requires refusing to accept normalization, refusing to treat harmful practices as unremarkable just because they are routine, maintaining moral sensitivity even when everyone around you has become desensitized. It requires recognizing the slippery slope, refusing to take the next step even when it seems like minor escalation, drawing lines before you end up somewhere you never intended to go. Most importantly, resistance requires accepting that it will cost you, that the systems are designed to punish resistance, that prioritizing ethics over institutional loyalty or professional advancement or material security comes with real consequences. The architecture of cruelty relies on most people being unwilling to pay these costs, relies on self-interest and conformity and fear of punishment ensuring compliance. Resistance is possible, but it is not easy and most people will not do it. And this is how ordinary people continue to participate in extraordinary harm. You are not monster. You are normal person. And that is exactly the problem. You participate in systemic cruelty not because you are individually evil, but because you are ordinary person operating within architectural structures designed to make ordinary people capable of harm. You follow orders and fulfill roles that distribute responsibility so thinly you never feel accountable. You interact with people through abstractions that render their humanity invisible. You use professional language that disguises harm as neutral procedure. You conform to normalized practices because everyone else participates and deviation is punished. You accept gradual escalations until you are somewhere you never intended to go. You comply because the system rewards participation and punishes resistance. This is the architecture of moral failure, not individual character flaws, but systemic structures that turn decent people into participants in harm, that make cruelty the path of least resistance, that ensure most people will comply, because resistance requires moral courage and willingness to sacrifice that most humans do not possess. The most devastating cruelty in history has been committed not by monsters but by ordinary people like you, doing their jobs, following orders, going along with the group, prioritizing their careers and security over the suffering of distant others. Understanding this does not absolve you of responsibility, but clarifies where responsibility actually lies, not just in individual moral choices, but in participation in systems that require harm to function. You are not exempt because you are a good person, or because you did not design these systems, or because you are just following orders. Your participation makes you responsible regardless of how the architecture distributes and disguises that responsibility. The question is not whether you are capable of participating in systemic cruelty, you already are, but whether you will continue participating once you understand what you are participating in. Will you refuse the orders, resist the conformity, reject the language, draw the line, accept the costs? Or will you continue doing what ordinary people have always done? Comply, conform, rationalize, participate in harm, while maintaining belief that you are a good person who would never do such things. The architecture of moral failure depends on your answer.